Shucky ducky.
I believe these words came from the Pokemon movie.
This economy is on life support. That's why my 999 plan is a bold solution. When they ask me who's the president of you, Becky, Stan, I'm going to say, I don't know. Do you know?
Herman Cain is one of Donald Trump's choices for the Federal Reserve, as is TV pundit Stephen Moore. In his syndicated column today in the Washington Post, George Will writes, whether their untidy sex lives are disqualifying, a sufficient disqualification is that both are notably partisan Trump acolytes and neither has satisfactory credentials or experience. The Fed's prestige is perishable and endangered by these two nominees. Joining us now, George F. Will, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for The Washington Post and an MSNBC political analyst. And George, I think the easiest thing we could do is laugh our way through these nominations. But one of the things that I thought was so important about your column was identifying the kinds of risks, serious, grave risks that these kinds of choices represent.
Well, first of all, if Mr. Trump thinks either of these two men is competent to sit on the Federal Reserve Board of Governors as one of 7, he probably also thinks, therefore, that they could serve as the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board itself, in the line of Greenspan, Volcker, McChesney Martin, and other giants of the financial world. We saw in 2008 how much depended on the prestige and trust, not just in the United States, but around the world, of other central bankers in the Federal Reserve. T.S. Eliot said in his play Murder in the Cathedral, the last temptation is the greatest treason, to do the right deed for the wrong reason. What's depressing here is that 4 Republican senators are showing flickering signs of independent judgment and might, they say, think about considering voting against these people, but largely because of their untidy personal lives, which means that the senators have yet to come to the conclusion that there are standards of competence and excellence that have to be met for certain institutions like the Supreme Court, but particularly the Federal Reserve Board. People say, well, the president's politicizing the Federal Reserve Board. Well, that's true, but any president will appoint a justice he agrees with or a Federal Reserve governor he agrees with. The problem is the Fed, unlike the Supreme Court, has immediate, direct, politically consequential actions that shape the competition of the parties. And to put obedient political acolytes on the Federal Reserve Board is therefore supremely dangerous.
And we've seen the president's public attempts to urge the Federal Reserve to go in one direction or another. In this case, he would just be able to pick up the phone.
He could pick up the phone, and it depends on who's on the other end of the phone. In his memoir, Paul Volcker, now in his 90s, tells the story that James Baker, then chief of staff for Ronald Reagan, called him to the White House before the '84 election and says, the president orders you not to raise interest rates. Volcker turned and walked out the door without saying a word. So improper was the assumption that presidents could dictate to the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board.
And that's the kind of person that the Senate has always been looking for, certainly when they get to the confirmation process, which I know in my experience, this position they took much more seriously than most.
It's very interesting. The Federal Reserve is a creature of Congress. Congress created it. It could, if it wanted, dictate monetary policy. In spite of repeated, intermittent urgings for it to do so, it has always refused, a sign of great institutional maturity that some things should be beyond politics, and monetary policy is one of them.
We have a report from the Kansas City Star that Herman Cain, at a lecture in Kansas City, referred to the Senate Banking Committee, the committee that would confirm him, referred to them, quote, as a bunch of yahoos. Not surprisingly, tonight, one news organization with anonymous sourcing is reporting that Herman Cain may be on the verge of dropping out. But I wish we had more time to talk about Stephen Moore, that I've spent some time on in other shows, because this is a difficult competition to talk about which one of these people is less qualified than the other.
Well, Stephen Moore has said that Chairman Powell of the Federal Reserve Board is incompetent. The interesting thing is that, therefore, he's committed to the standard of competence, and I don't think that's in Stephen Moore's interest.
George Will gets tonight's last word. George, thank you very much for joining us. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.